Wuthering Heights is such a divisive book. Most people either love it or they hate it. And when I finished it, I found myself somewhere in between and truly just unable to articulate the way I felt about it. So I read it again and annotated it, and this is my very spoilery book discussion of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Haley and I am a Christian wife, homeschooling mother of 3, out to redeem my very own literary education. And in order to do that, I'm participating in Victober, which is an October reading challenge encouraging you to read more Victorian literature. And for this challenge, I read Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This book fits into the prompt, a Victorian novel that plays with form, because the narration of this is so strange, which is actually the reason why I avoided reading it for years. I did a spoiler-free book review of Wuthering Heights, so if you have not read Wuthering Heights, go watch that video first, then read Wuthering Heights, and then come back to this video, because this video is basically me venting and ranting and sorting out all of my thoughts on Wuthering Heights. So it's full of spoilers. So at this point, if you're still watching the video, I hope you've read Wuthering Heights. And if you've not, I'll see you next time, friend. Go read the book first. But this book shocked me. If you watched my spoiler-free book review, you know that it's not what I was expecting. I was expecting a love story, right? Like Heathcliff and Cathy are this dynamic romantic duo that you hear a lot. So I had some pre-assumptions about this book that were just dead wrong. This is not a love story. It's a story of revenge. And I'm gonna be perfectly honest with y'all. I would argue that Heathcliff loved Cathy, but I'm gonna argue that Cathy did not love Heathcliff. I am so disappointed by this book because all of the really great quotes about love that were so poetic and beautiful were from Cathy, who married another man and said that it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff. That just bothered me, and I'll be honest, I think I disliked Cathy more than I disliked Heathcliff, which is saying a lot because Heathcliff is a villain, a fiend, a vampire, a goblin, and all of the crazy ways that Emily Bronte used to describe him through her characters. But Cathy was just selfish, prideful, vain. I felt like she loved Heathcliff's love for her, and that's why she felt like she needed him, because I think Cathy loved to be worshipped, which is why she wanted to, personally, I think, have her cake and eat it too whenever she married Edgar Linton, but refused to be separated from Heathcliff. Oh, that bothered me. And I really felt like my sympathies actually lined up with Nellie's, who is the narrator of Wuthering Heights, the servant who was like a mother figure to them. Now, we're told the story of Wuthering Heights through Nellie, the servant, so that may be why I sympathized a lot with her. But through her eyes, yeah, I would have seen so much of this the same way. In the beginning of the story, Nellie is sympathetic to Heathcliff. There's a point where Edgar Linton enters the scene as Cathy's potential lover and Heathcliff's potential rival, and Nellie is kind of encouraging Heathcliff, like, who is Edgar Linton compared to you? He is scrawny and you are strong. Who knows? For all you know, you could be born from a prince, basically. And I was like, yeah, I agree. You know, this Edgar Linton character just needs to go away, basically. But that's not what happened. Kathy decided to marry him out of her pride. She said it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff, which just absolutely blew my mind because they basically live in a neighborhood where there's nobody else there. So they're so isolated at Wuthering Heights. Why would she care what anyone else thought? I mean, Heathcliff would have moved heaven and earth and mountains to become a wealthy and respectable person. And had Kathy just given him the chance, she could have made him a better man. Now, perhaps not a good man, because Kathy is still horrible and Heathcliff is still horrible. But we could have avoided all of the drama that occurred from Kathy's rejection of Heathcliff. And there is a little tiny piece of me that doesn't blame Heathcliff, sort of, kind of, for at bare minimum feeling the way he feels. The Earnshaws, other than the father, all treated him absolutely terribly. And then for Kathy to reject him, and he still holds out that love for her, and then has to be around her when she's dying and be around Edgar. And Kathy, when she's on her deathbed, accuses Heathcliff of being her murderer, that he put her there. I just really disliked that woman. And there's a reason why Heathcliff is crazy as he is. He is obsessed with a horrible person, which says something about his character as well, because we also know that he is dark. But I couldn't stand her, and I felt myself sympathizing with Nellie almost the entire way through. There was a line, and I really hope I can find it in here. I annotated this, and it just showed Nellie's snarkiness, but honestly also just her ability to pick out character. There's a point where Kathy says, "If I were in heaven, Nellie, I should be extremely miserable." And Nellie says, "Because you are not fit to go there," I answered. "All sinners would be miserable in heaven." Yes, I agree. Kathy's just, she's terrible. But something I liked about Nellie was, despite her disdain for Kathy, she still kind of does her best to do the right thing. Now, what I loved about Nellie, she's honestly probably my favorite character, is that she is a Christian. And a lot of people reading this book, especially maybe if you're not a Christian, would think, oh, well, Nellie's super hypocritical because she does a couple of things that are totally wrong in this book, and yet she is calling several of these characters to repent. She brings up God to almost every one of them in some situation or another. But that's what a real Christian is. A real Christian has mostly good intentions, will almost always do the right thing, but will also fall to sin and to prejudice and to misjudging or misreading a situation. There was even a point in the book where Nellie was talking to Mr. Lockwood, and I think this was after Kathy was on her deathbed and she let Heathcliff come in, but she was kind of questioning herself. Was that right or was that wrong? I didn't know. It felt like the right thing to do at the right time. And I loved that about her character, and her perspective on several things is kind of what made this story good for me. Because this is a horrible story about horrible people who do horrible things, which I think is the point. I think Emily Bronte wrote this to be a very thrilling, enthralling, and gripping tale. You're not supposed to really love it or the people, but you can't help but look away. You want to know what happens. And because she narrates the story through Nellie, you're able to read it. Because if you were in Heathcliff's and Kathy's heads, you would have hated the book because they're awful people and you wouldn't want to be in their heads. But the fact that she chose to tell the story in this way was phenomenal. And another thing I loved about Nellie is when Kathy was telling her that she was going to marry Edgar Linton, which Nellie knew was horrible. She was like, well, why do you love him? And Kathy was naming all of these really vain, shallow reasons. And Nellie was like, bad still, worse, even worse. And I just thought that was funny. So I appreciated her snark throughout the book and her sass. And I feel like a lot of it was actually really justified. But what I also loved about her is that she still had the right frame of mind when it was necessary. So before Kathy married Edgar, she was all for Kathy and Heathcliff. But the second she married Edgar, she said, nope, you two are married. This is right. You love Edgar. I hope for happiness for the two of you. And she switches to that frame of mind, which is the correct Christian view to see things. But on the opposite side of Nellie, we have Joseph, who is another depiction of Christianity in Wuthering Heights that is very, very interesting. And Nellie herself describes him in a really funny and snarky way. If I can find it here. Here it is. Joseph, the servant, you saw him, I dare say, up yonder. He was and is yet, most likely, the wearisomest self-righteous Pharisee that ever ransacked a Bible to rake the promises to himself and fling the curses on his neighbors. That is so true. And so you have Nellie, who I would argue is a real and normal Christian. She tries to do the right thing. She knows the right thing to do, but she's not perfect. Then you have Joseph, who is the definition of what Paul talks about in the book of Corinthians in the New Testament, that you do all these things, but you have no love. Joseph was just spewing venom to everyone around him, but putting it in the light of religion, which is horrible. That is not what Jesus was for. That's not what Christians are for. That puts a horrible light on Christianity. But it's a reality and it's a real character, and his character in this book was pretty entertaining because, you know, there are times that he definitely was overboard, but I mean, there were a few times that maybe he was correct. So also an interesting dynamic. And then you have sort of the respectable members of the community who just go to church, but you never really hear them talk about God, like Edgar and Isabella Linton and the Earnshaw family. But then you have characters like Heathcliff, who absolutely outright reject God, and he doesn't necessarily say that he doesn't believe in him, he just rejects it. There's a point, I think, where Nellie actually brings up to him to let God serve the justice, and Heathcliff was like, God will not have the satisfaction that I shall. And then on his deathbed, Kathy, Nellie is like, you know, you still have a chance for repentance, basically. And he's like, I certainly want no part of that. I want my own heaven. It's like, okay, all right then. And then there's this whole question, which I like the way that Emily Bronte does this, is who was right and who is wrong. I don't feel like Emily Bronte pronounces exact judgments on her characters. She kind of leaves the reader to do that yourself. So there's a point where Nellie is recounting this story to Mr. Lockwood, and she says, but you won't want my moralizing. And I kind of feel like that's what Emily Bronte was saying when she wrote this. A lot of people didn't like the book because they said it didn't have a moral. But I think Emily Bronte left you to be the judge. So did these characters deserve happiness? Did they deserve heaven? Did they deserve hell? You know, like Edgar Linton is someone like, okay, he probably could have gone to heaven. Kathy, I don't know. And there's a point after Kathy dies that she's talking to Heathcliff, and she's like, no, she went perfectly quietly and she is at peace, insinuating heaven. And Heathcliff was like, is she? Did she repent? Is she in heaven? Because we all know she was pretty terrible and maybe didn't deserve to go. But at the end of the book, it also kind of insinuates a supernatural potential happily ever after for Heathcliff and Kathy. Maybe if they're ghosts wandering the heights. Do I think they deserved it? No, if that's the case. I, as a Christian, don't think that's the case. I like how Emily Bronte in the book leaves those for you to decide. Even all of the supernatural things that happen in Wuthering Heights that could be taken as literal supernatural things, or could be taken as just figment of the imagination or the result of a bad health condition. It's kind of up to the reader, which makes it a really interesting book. That takes some skill to write that way. And so now moving on to the Lintons, Edgar and Isabella Linton, the siblings. Personally, I didn't feel sorry for either one of them because they had clear clues and signs to the characters of Kathy and Heathcliff. Linton got to see firsthand Kathy's deceit and violence to Nellie. He witnessed it, he ignored it, and married her anyway. Even knowing her attachment to Heathcliff, he married her anyway. He tolerated it anyway. It's a kind of brought upon by himself, really, and Isabella, I kind of felt the same way. Now, she wasn't as weak as her brother Edgar. She kind of had a deep down resentful, vengeful, potentially violent side. She was not going to take it, but she was well warned about Heathcliff's character by Kathy, by Nellie, and by Heathcliff himself. So there was a moment where I felt kind of sorry for her when Nellie was trying to nicely find a way to tell her that her brother didn't want anything to do with her anymore. I know that felt really, really lonely, but she did bring it upon herself. And there was a moment where I thought her and Henley were going to team up to take some revenge on Heathcliff. I thought she would do it. She didn't, which is a credit to her character, honestly. She handled that situation well. And as far as Henley is concerned, I did feel sorry for him because, well, he was cruel to Heathcliff, so I don't feel that sorry for him. That's the thing about this book. All the characters were terrible in some way, shape, or form, but I felt like he really loved his wife from the beginning of the book that passed away. But there was a point where Nellie was comparing Henley to Edgar. Edgar has lost his wife, Kathy, but has this great love for Catherine Jr. that redeems him and redeems the situation. Henley is in great despair from the loss of his wife and her death and just completely ignores Hareton and lets him fall into the hands of Heathcliff. Heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. And so now we have this second generation, the second generation that comes into play in this book, which I didn't expect. I thought this entire book was going to be about Heathcliff and Kathy. Kathy died halfway through, and I was not prepared or expecting that. I had no idea there was this whole second generation. It's just never talked about when this book is brought up, really. But I was rooting for them. I was rooting for the second generation, particularly Hareton and Catherine Jr. Now, Catherine Jr. was a little bit spoiled, like her mother, had some prejudice against Hareton that I really didn't like, but I love that their relationship grew from that misunderstanding to love. They finally got their happy ending. There was a point in the book where Nellie is telling all of the things that happened to Mr. Lockwood, and she says, you know, no person will be happier than I at their union. They deserve their happily ever after. And I could not have agreed more, because Hareton, I would say, is probably the only truly, genuinely innocent and good throughout this whole book. He was like the real person who just really did not deserve anything bad that he got. So I was rooting for him. And Catherine, although she was kind of haughty at moments, was mostly good and completely trapped and tricked and manipulated by Linton, Heathcliff's son, which I absolutely hated reading about. Ugh, that was almost a form of justice to Heathcliff for him to have such a, Nellie called him like a sniveling weakling for a son. And I was like, yeah, that's what he gets, being all this violence and rage, and has this delicate, sniveling little weakling son. Ugh, I really didn't like his character at all either, and I'm glad that Catherine Jr. and Hareton got their happy endings. That was a lot. This book was a lot. I had a lot of thoughts and feelings on it. I didn't really know where I stood, but after kind of meditating on the story and thinking about it and talking it out, I think I'm of the conclusion that I did love it. I didn't love the characters. I didn't love their actions. But this was a literary masterpiece. The poetic language, The beautiful atmosphere. I could see this book happening so clearly in my head. I could feel the chill of the air, the cold, damp rooms with the warm glow of the fire, the cold moors with the wind whipping. I could feel it. And for her to be able to write that, and I as the reader completely experience the atmosphere, is phenomenal. This book would be perfect to read in fall or winter, just any half of that part of the year. But I loved it. The story was gripping. It's not a story you go around saying you love because it's so terrible, but it's a story you would read again and again because it's just so shocking and you can't tear your eyes away from it. So, at that, I think I loved Wuthering Heights. I think I would read it again and I would recommend it to someone else. So that is the camp that I fall in. If you have read Wuthering Heights, which I hope you have, because if not, I've just spoiled the entire thing for you, please tell me in the comments below what you thought of it, if you agreed or if you disagreed with some of my feelings and opinions. Just let me know what you thought, because I would love to talk about this book with somebody, anybody. So thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Happy reading!